New World is going to be adding some artificial difficulty, and I think it's a little bit dumb. So this is actually a relatively complex subject, so please bear with me a second. But in the expedition mutators, the difficulty of that mutator is going to be dependent a little bit on your gear score. There is essentially gear score scaling. Now, this is purely from the patch notes. I haven't really been testing this on the PTR, but the patch notes are pretty clear. I just don't know the extent of the patch notes. Like, I don't know how significant this scaling is. Only time will really tell that. So in theory, in these expedition mutators, let's say you had a character that had a 550 gear score, but now let's say you had a character that had a 625 gear score, but let's say they had the same defenses in terms of stats, so the same armor value and the same health and that kind of thing, which would be possible because you could, you know, spec into damage and that kind of thing. From reading the patch notes, it sounds like the 550 gear score character will take more damage, and that's purely because of the gear score. Now, you might be there sat like, Jay, that sounds wrong, that doesn't sound right, but that literally is what the patch notes imply, and I agree it sounds a little bit silly. Now, it's worth noting that this scaling only applies to the expedition mutators. PvP, for example, has a different set of scaling, which I'm actually less bothered about the scaling in PvP, because basically it's just making it so that somebody who's completely fully kitted out in like BIS gear isn't going to just smash on anybody in PvP without any effort. So the scaling like might sound a little bit silly at first, but I think there's a good reason they're implementing it. I just don't agree with that reason. And really the reason boils down to this: they want to give you a reward, but they don't want the reward to be too powerful. When you upgrade an item from 600 to 625, the actual powerfulness in terms of stats doesn't appear to be very much. It appears to be like one stat point and then maybe like a little bit of percentages here and there, you know, increasing the armor rating and that kind of thing. I'm seeing numbers ranging from maybe like 1 to 5% better. I haven't actually seen a 625 piece compared to a 600 piece, so I don't technically know the number myself, but the consensus seems to be that it's actually not that much more powerful than a 600 piece. So then you might think, well, why even bother? Well, it turns out that maybe this scaling means that you have to bother, but also it is going to give you a little bit of an advantage in PvP to have the better gear and the better stats and that kind of thing. So most players are going to want to actually bother. So I just think that the scaling is there to essentially force people to do this grind and get their gear score up to 625 so that they can actually participate in those difficult expedition mutators, rather than they didn't want to give you like a really strong reward that would butcher everybody in PvP, because otherwise they're pretty much saying you like pretty much have to do the expedition mutators. Yes, you can get them via crafting, and yes, you can get them via the gypsum, but it doesn't seem like that's a very speedy way of doing it as opposed to these mutators, obviously because the mutators are difficult. But I think there's actually a couple of side effects to Amazon's decision to do this. Number one, you might artificially be creating a grind for these hardcore players. For example, I'm not 100% sure it's going to be like possible to just go from like 1 to 10, just doing each one of them once and upgrading your gear as you go. The actual recommendation for your gear score, even for a level 10 mutator, is actually 600 to 625. So it literally might be possible to do them without upping your gear score beyond 600, but they're definitely not going to want you to do it with like 570 gear. So it might even be that I'm even wrong about why they are doing the scaling. Maybe I'm completely misunderstanding what Amazon were intending there. I think one advantage of your Amazon is that to them it looks like they're providing content. You know, you now have to grind your gear score up from 600 to 625 doing these expedition mutators, and that sort of progression. And the second advantage that they have is that I think for Amazon it might be now a little bit easier for them to balance the expedition mutators, because they can just say, hey, unless you've got this high gear score, it's going to do more damage to you. I'm not a game designer, I don't actually know if that is easier, but those are the two side effects for Amazon that I think they might be happy with in that system. For casuals, it's sort of like, well, you're giving us content by having a grind, and the grind for some of us won't be fun. I do not really like the idea of just like repeating dungeons on repeat. It just seems like no fun to me. But for me, this whole problem means that you're essentially gating content behind an artificial difficulty rather than by skill. Maybe I'm just old school, but I believe that the difficulty should just be the same for each person. It shouldn't really matter that if like I have 625 gear score versus I have 600, the damage should hit me for whatever amount they're going to hit me for, and then my like mitigation in my armor and stuff like that should be the thing that really like factors in, not this like artificial gear score number. The gear score is supposed to be like an indication of the strength of an item, as is like epic and legendary and stuff like that. It's not actually, to me, supposed to represent the actual damage or the defense that it provides. But that's the situation we're in now. And I sort of think that if you're a really skilled player, and maybe you're not a hardcore, maybe you're not a casual player, you're somewhere in between, maybe you have 580 gear or something like that, maybe you should be able to make up the difference by your skill. Now, what they're saying here is that, well, actually you're going to have to do that plus a little bit more, because we're artificially going to make them do more damage to you, ignoring your actual mitigation. I also wonder if this is like a little bit of an admission from Amazon that they can't properly create difficult content without this scaling, or more likely I think they are simply just choosing to add this like grind into this mix, and the scaling seems like an easy way for them to do it. Because as I said, yeah, I think a mob should just hit you for whatever amount they're going to hit, and I think that the difficulty should just increase when it comes to like tactics and knowing the mechanics and that kind of thing, which, to be fair, the expedition mutators are also adding. Like, it does seem like they are going to be more difficult in terms of the actual challenge regardless of the scaling. So for me, it's sort of like, why even bother with the scaling? It goes back to the rewards. I feel like they need to give you a reward that is useful and that you think is useful, and this is one way of sort of tricking you into that. I just don't think it's a very good idea. I think it's not really what players want, but we're sort of being like forced to have it, and I don't really feel like it's going to be fun for anybody, but people are just going to get used to it and accept it. And I don't know, I just don't really like the sound of this scaling. I don't really like scaling in MMOs as a whole, because it sort of feels like it goes away from that traditional RPG thing. And to be fair, even like RPGs do this now, where the difficulty of the content you're facing is dependent on your level, and I don't know, that's really not what I personally like from games. But I can appreciate that there are advantages to that system, and there are reasons and good things that Amazon are doing with this system. I just don't like it, but I completely understand that they get benefits from doing it this way. Just in general, I can't help but look at the scaling and think Amazon are deliberately putting that there to sort of slow down your progression, rather than just letting you say, okay, if you are the best player and you can overcome the difficulty with your skill, crack on. Otherwise, you're going to have to slowly build up the quality of your gear and take it down. Which, by the way, I just would like to clarify, as a concept, getting better gear and then doing harder content is something that MMOs are essentially built on. Like, if you look at end raids for World of Warcraft, that's generally what happens. You release a new raid, you have to get the gear from that to do the next one, otherwise you're going to be like at a disadvantage. So that as an idea isn't a problem. I just don't like the artificial nature at which Amazon are doing it, even though I think there are good reasons, because it's true, we don't want somebody who's just spending all day in expedition mutators destroying everybody in PvP. That seems like just another problem that could occur if you don't have this scaling. So I'm not trying to say it's not going to work and it's not effective. I just think as a concept we need to just get rid of scaling, especially with PvE. In PvP, I think it's less of a problem, and PvP for me should be more about skill. I just wish that PvE was also more about skill, but weirdly the scaling is actually making it less about skill and more about time. So the concept of scaling is sort of working in two different ways. In PvP, it makes actually the battles more harder for everybody involved. In PvE, it's just turning it into a time grind, as well as skill. Obviously, if you do get to like the mutator level 10, I'm sure you're a far better player than me and you will deserve it. I'm not trying to say you won't. So I just don't like scaling. I also don't really like the fact that it's now a different progression system, like so soon after the game is released. There's quite a few things I would change. Like, I feel like gear that's not 600 should be able to be improved by 25, so that if you have a 599 piece, well, you can get it to 624. I feel like that would be fine. There's loads of little things like that I think they could do, and it sort of pains me that we're not really hearing anything from them at the moment, and we're all just going to probably accept it in a couple of months. A bit of a rambly video. It was hard for me to like structure this one because just the concept of it is a little bit weird, but hopefully you understand what I mean. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Do like this video if you like this video. If you're not subscribed to the channel, please do subscribe. It really does help. Have a most beautiful day. Goodbye.